Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Dr. Timothy Paul Jones, and our topic is Christian apologetics. Dr. Jones, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
It is great to be with you today.
Let me tell you all about Timothy Paul Jones. Dr. Jones is a professor and director for the Center of Christian Apologetics at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. He oversees doctoral studies while also teaching in the areas of apologetics and family ministry. Before coming to Southern, he led churches in Missouri and Oklahoma as pastor and associate pastor. Dr. Jones has authored or edited more than a dozen books, including The God Who Goes Before You, Perspectives on Family Ministry, and Christian History Made Easy. In 2016, the Evangelical Christian Publishing Association awarded Dr. Jones a Gold Medallion Book of the Year award for his book, How We Got the Bible. He's married to Rayanne, and they have 4 daughters, Hannah, Skylar, Kylan, and Katricia. Dr. Jones serves as one of the teaching pastors at Sojourn Midtown here in Louisville. So let's jump right into these questions. Dr. Jones, how do you define Christian apologetics, and how did you get into that field?
Well, apologetics, one of the things I never want to assume, and this is because I'm a pastor of ordinary people, right. First and foremost, before I ever end up being a professor, before I was ever a professor, I was a pastor of ordinary people. So one of the things when I talk about apologetics, first, I want to make sure people that just know what the word means, first off, because often we hear it and we think of the word apologize, and people are like, why are you apologizing for Jesus? We don't need to apologize for Jesus. Jesus isn't something we apologize for. But to help people understand that, it comes from a Greek word, apologia, which that Greek word means a defense. So when we talk about apologetics, we're talking about defending the truth about Jesus. And suddenly when we hear that, we realize, oh, okay, that is something we want to do. We want to defend the truth about Jesus. And so the way I define apologetics, at least in the classroom, is the church's reverent, reasonable, and humble defense through our words and through our lives of the hope we have in the risen Christ, as this hope is revealed in his word and in his world. Now, the key words in that are reverent, reasonable, and humble. In other words, it's reverent in the sense that, again, 1 Peter chapter 3, going back to that right there, and that it's supposed to be done in the fear of God, in a reverence of God, in awe of God. There's a worshipful aspect to apologetics done well and done right. It's reasonable. It's not just, I feel like this is the truth, or I think this ought to be the truth. It's saying you have real reasons for the truth that you're articulating, and it's humble. That comes from 1 Peter 3 as well, that it says we are to do this with reverence and reverence or fear, as another way to translate that, and meekness or humbleness, humility, gentleness and fear. And so we should do this with humility, not with an arrogant attitude, because that when we try to present the truth about God, but do so in a haughty or arrogant way, or just trying to win an argument, we actually are not articulating and living out the grace by which God brought us to himself in the first place. That requires humility. That calls us to humility. And so that's how I define apologetics. It's defending the truth of Jesus in a way that is reverent, that is reasonable, and that is humble. That's the attitude and the way that we should defend the truth about Jesus. And you asked how I became interested in this. And the reason I became interested in apologetics is because I needed apologetics. And I didn't even know the word apologetics when I started needing apologetics. I needed apologetics, and I didn't even know the word yet. So I was raised in a church in which it was a very narrow understanding of the gospel. In some sense, there wasn't even an understanding of the gospel at some level, and it was very rigid in the sense of we were taught things that the King James Version had been perfectly preserved by God, and there was no other possible version of the Bible that could ever be used. I'm great with people using the King James Version. This wasn't just a preference. It was, this is the only Bible that there is, and this is the only Bible that is God's word. That was the attitude there. This isn't about people using it that praise God that you use it and read it if that's what you use. But this was a very different view. And I got to college. I'd never been to college, never thought about college really, or not known what it was. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college and ever finished college. I didn't have any people in my life that had gone to college. I didn't know what to expect when I got to college. So I got to college, and in the first year of college, I started taking classes in Greek and New Testament and Old Testament, all the classes I could in these areas. And suddenly I realized that the things I had been told about the Bible weren't actually completely true. and they started falling apart. And then in the midst of that, one of the jobs I worked 3 part-time jobs during that time to earn my way through college. And one of my part-time jobs was that I worked in a library. And so I remember I was shelving the books one day, and I was putting a book up on the shelf, and it's by a guy named Bertrand Russell. There was a book I was putting on the shelf, and the name of the book was Why I Am Not a Christian. And that struck me at that point. I was having all these questions, all these doubts, all these struggles. And here's a book that says Why I Am Not a Christian. And so I put the book on the shelf, and then I pulled the book back off the shelf. And once I went to the desk in the library where I worked, I read through that book. Now, I didn't know it at the time. That's a terrible argument against Christianity, but I didn't know it at the time. It seemed really plausible to me. And after I read that book by Bertrand Russell, I read the next book on that shelf, and the next book, which these were the books of atheists and atheist philosophy, philosophers, things like that. Was this, and I started reading, and little by little, I worked my way through this whole shelf. By the end of reading so many of these, my faith was just falling apart, because I didn't know there were reasons to believe the truth about Jesus. I really didn't know there were good, defensible reasons for that. And in the midst of that, I ran across a book by C.S. Lewis. Most people, it's Mere Christianity. For me, it was a different one. For me, it was a book called Surprised by Joy. And the reason Surprised by Joy appealed to me, the reason it grabbed me, the reason it became something that for me was a life-changing thing, is because C.S. Lewis in that book describes his trajectory from atheism to Christianity. And I felt like I was on the opposite trajectory, from Christianity to atheism. And so because of that, I was seeing somebody on the opposite trajectory. And I was seeing, first off, that many of the questions I had, other people had already answered and dealt with. And not only that, it didn't solve everything just to go toward atheism. And so I learned apologetics there and began reading more and more about apologetics from that point. And that was how I started being interested in apologetics. And once I found out what apologetics was, then I decided, and pretty much my whole life since then has been, how do we help people, both children and families, and that's why I've done family ministry, a lot of that, but also in other areas. How do we help people know there are good reasons to hold on to your faith, even in college and other places that it may be challenged?
So you were having a very private struggle probably 30 years ago, just guessing as far age and years, that many people are having very publicly now, but God was preparing you for something 30 years ago that would have you positioned today. So you discovered C.S. Lewis. Who were some other authors that you read along with your Bible, Dr. Jones, that really helped you at that time?
So one of them was F.F. Bruce. Now, some people in a previous generation recognize that name. He doesn't get read that much anymore, but he wrote a book called The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And at that point, I tell students, you have no idea how wonderful the resources you have now are, because all that I could find about the authenticity of the New Testament, there were 3 books, and I looked and looked, was F.F. Bruce and this book called The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And then 2 books by Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and More Than a Carpenter. That was it. That was all I could find. Now, there might have been other books that I don't know about that were around then, but I searched and searched, and I was a librarian during this time. So there were books, and yet I could find 3 books is all I could find to actually defend the truthfulness of the Gospels. And so those books became huge for me, and especially F.F. Bruce, because it was clear that he was an excellent scholar. And yet he believed that the Bible, the events in it really happened the way they're recounted in the Bible. And that was something that I needed. And that in many different ways, if you look at the books I've written in the years since then, almost all of them you can trace back to a trajectory that began with F.F. Bruce, his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?
So, Dr. Jones, along with your own books, and you've written more than a dozen, or written or edited more than a dozen, who are some other contemporary writers so you mentioned Josh McDowell, very accessible for the average reader. Who are some folks kind of at that level today that could be helpful for people who are trying to think through some of these tough questions?
I think one of the leading upcoming apologists that I would point to is Josh Chatreau, Chatreau. R-A-W is how you spell his last name, Josh Chatro. He's written Telling a Better Story. He's written a book that's coming out on the apologetics of Augustine that's coming out in a few months. He's really engaging with people where they actually are. He understands the world as it is right now.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the ones that I would point to. It's not just about the facts that he's reporting, though that certainly is good. It's about that he understands the way people are thinking. Another one I would say is Rebecca McLaughlin. She's done some phenomenal work on just confronting Christianity, the hard questions about Christianity, and not shying away from those. At a more academic level, if people want to dig deeper, Richard Bauckham, his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, just a phenomenal book articulating the case for the truthfulness of the Gospels. And a guy who's at Southern Seminary this week doing lectures, Peter Williams, has written a book called Can We Trust the Gospels? Again, excellent book.
That's very helpful. So let's move into, you recently gave your faculty address at Southern Seminary. And you made a statement there. The title was, I think, Brothers and Sisters, we are all apologists now. But I want us to spend a little time talking about that the address. Tell us what a faculty address is. That's not just a talk that you went and gave one day. It's a pretty big deal. And then we'll get to the title and more about that.
Yeah. Excuse me.
That's right.
So your faculty address is something you give one time in your lifetime as a scholar. You, excuse me, you give it one time in your lifetime as a scholar. And in that, you are giving the sort of the summation of your scholarship so far, as well as where your scholarship is going to be going in the future. So, excuse me.
And let me give you a chance to get a drink, and I'll comment. So I listened to it last week. We're going to put the link on the Facebook page, but also on the I think we can put it on the podcast as well. Dr. Jones, every Christian today who wants to be a witness for Christ, which ought to be every Christian, should listen to your address. It's a little more academic than folks are going to hear on a Sunday morning sermon, probably, but it's just outstanding. So go right ahead and talk more about this notion of your academic address.
So yeah, you give your sort of the future of your field, basically.
Yeah.
And so what I want to do in this one thing you do, you're summarizing your field and giving the future of it. What I wanted to do was in this to be able to help people understand how apologetics has changed and where it's got to head in the future. Because I feel like in many ways we are still stuck in an apologetics from about a decade ago, maybe 20 years ago, and we need to get a new approach to apologetics.
So apologetics is a defense of the gospel. It's a defense of Jesus' life and teaching, and it answers questions that people are asking. But you're saying we might be answering questions that nobody's asking right now. So with your title, Brothers and Sisters, we are all apologists now, what were you trying to communicate with that title?
So what I wanted people to understand is that for centuries, Christianity was just assumed to be good for the world. Mm-hmm. We just got to recognize for a long, long time, and I'm not saying this to lament and whine about the way things are or the way things have been. There were bad things in the past, good things in the past, but let's just recognize for a long time, Christianity was just considered to be good for the world. People just assumed the basic goodness of Christianity, that if Christians were in the world, it was a better place.
Right.
That is no longer assumed. Yeah. Apologetics back then could, because it was assumed, the goodness of Christianity, its apologetics could focus on defending the Christian miracles and Christian ways of thinking. And so we were doing evidential apologetics, we were doing worldview apologetics, all these things like this that are good things. I'm not saying those things are bad. It's just that made sense because people just assumed that Christianity was good. Christianity is no longer considered or assumed to be good for the world.
Yeah.
And when Christianity is no longer considered to be a good thing for the world, every Christian will be called on to defend our faith. Not just our faith is in its beliefs, but our very way of being faithfully in the world. That's the problem right now, is that it's not just your faith as in your beliefs. Nobody really cares at some level about your beliefs right now. And that's not entirely true, but it's that's not the primary focus. It's that the question is it even good for us to have Christians, for there to be Christians? Do Christians even actually make the world a better place? That is a radical change, but we are still doing apologetics that's all about defending the miracles, defending a Christian way of thinking. Those are the things that we're thinking about now, where we have to be able to say, Christianity, how do we show it's good for the world? Now, that I'm not saying that's going to convince people. What we do is not going to convince people necessarily that it is good for the world. I'm not pretending that it is. Yeah. But I'm saying our apologetic has to focus on the goodness of Christianity for human flourishing and thriving, that it really is good for the world. That's something that is difficult for us to do. It's a shift that we have to make, and it makes us all apologists now.
All right, so we have an audio clip from your message, so we're going to go ahead and play that now and then give you a chance to react to it.
Mm-hmm. The responsibility of apologetics to point out these contradictions is perhaps more crucial than ever. Today, the inconsistencies may be found in other places, for example, in the contradiction between the affirmation of human equality and dignity on the one hand and a rejection of humanity's formation in the image of God on the other hand. What this should shape within the Christian is a humble confidence.
So talk about that humble confidence, if you would, for a moment. What do you mean by that apologetics should shape in us a humble confidence?
So here's what's really important that I think we can often miss in this, is that in everything that every belief system that is out there, there is some trace of the goodness, the truth, the beauty of God in it. There is no worldview so twisted or fallen that there is no trace of that in it. Now, it may be distorted, it may be darkened and dimmed and distorted and misused and misdirected, but it's there. But here's what I want us to see in this, is that since there is some aspect of truth in every competing idea to Christianity, because there is something that is coherent with Christianity, but it's not coherent with that system. So here's what that means practically, is this why we can have confidence. Anything that somebody articulates outside of Christian faith, somewhere they're going to contradict themselves. We can be confident because they're going to contradict themselves. Mm-hmm. They can't help it, because what is in their system is some strand of truth, beauty, or goodness that comes from God that they have distorted and twisted. And so because of that, it doesn't actually fit or belong in their system. And so they're going to contradict themselves at some point. And so we can be confident whenever we engage somebody that somewhere in what they are articulating, there is a crack. There is a place where something doesn't fit. There is a contradiction that we can show, you know what, that one tiny trace of truth that you have, and it's a tiny one, but that you have, your whole system requires it, but it doesn't actually fit with your system. But I have a faith that fits with. So that's what our apologetics should do.
So I think Greg Kuchel would say that he wants to help you see the holes in your worldview, and you're describing that as well. Dr. Jones, I want to help us a little bit more with this notion that many of the folks that we're going to share the gospel with in today's culture are going to view Christianity as the enemy to their own worldview system. Can you give us some examples of how that might be the case, and then how do we speak to that?
Yeah, I just to give a few examples of real life things in this, so that have happened over the past few years. 2019, there's a British physician. His name is David Macareth, and he would not call somebody by something other than their birth gender. So he refused to use the transgender pronouns people were preferring. And what this is not that remarkable at the level of the pushback against it, but here's what is remarkable. It was the reason that the judge gave, or the tribunal gave, for saying you cannot any longer be employed by the British government as a physician. And here was the reason they gave. They said it is because your belief in Genesis 1:27 about humanity created in male and female, your disbelief in transgender is harmful to people. It's harmful to people. So they weren't just saying, and you actually see an echo of this back in 2013 in one of the decisions that paved the way for the legalization of gay marriage in the United States, where basically it was that anybody who resists this does so because of an animus of some sort, a negative. It's not that you have good reasons for it. It's rather that you actually just have you're just biased against people rather than having some reason for it. And it's not just irrational at one level to think of this because of the fact that that this is something that has stood for centuries, and suddenly culture has changed, and suddenly, oh, this is just unthinkable at all to believe in Genesis. I mean, it's also ridiculous at the level of Genesis 1:27. The tradition of jurisprudence that traces back to Genesis 1:27 is why we have human rights and dignity in the first place, in the way we think about things. But there's all these issues here. But the key issue I want people to see is it is just an assumption that Christianity in its traditional historical form is not good for human flourishing, is not good for civic society. It's not good. And we see that all around us. And my response to that, I don't want us to just lament and throw our hands up in the air about it, but I want us to be realistic and sober about it and say, this is the world we live in. How do we minister in the place that God has placed us and do so effectively and well and lovingly and meaningfully where we are? And that's what I want us to be thinking about.
And this is the day we've been called to live in. We weren't called to live in another century or in another place. And so living a faithful Christian life, faithful to Christ in a culture that views us as the enemy, I would think a couple of reactions could be some folks will compromise and maybe go along with some things and begin to compromise their convictions. Others want to run to a cave and just hide out. Neither of those are good options. Mm-hmm. So how do we live faithfully in a world that may view us as the enemy?
Well, I want to think one of the things we do, it's one of the things I addressed in the faculty address, is that we live our faith without shame publicly. Yeah. But we don't necessarily expect that that's going to make us to be greeted with open arms in the world around us. And I think that we have some people who, they want to hide away. They want to just kind of take an option of hiding away from the world and hunkering down and forming communities underground, so to speak. And that's not how we're called to live. But neither is it some sort of an arrogant, flagrant, we're going to take over things. Neither is it that. Yeah. It is faithfully living it out in the world, publicly living what we believe in a way of recognizing we're probably not going to change the world as a whole. We are going to rather form a community of people who will outlast all the things that we're seeing in the world. And I think that should be our goal, is to say we are going to live this in such a way that we will do public good. We will do civic good. We will have a community, a church that does civic good, not because we think we're going to convince the world that, yes, you like us after all. It's rather because that is the type of community that is going to outlast all these ebbs and flows of the culture. And I think that's what we're called to. I think that's what we're called to do in terms of our faithfulness in the church.
Dr. Jones, my early days as a believer, I was saved when I was 24. I'm 58 now, so 34 years with the Lord. Christians living out their good deeds was viewed as as you said, very virtuous, a positive thing. There's a believer living out their life, they're making a difference. But as we're living out the gospel today, we're offering to do public good, maybe of taking care of foster children or adopting unwanted children, but that may not be viewed as good at all. We're opposing abortion, saying we'll take your babies, but that's not going to be viewed as good. We can love a person who's in an LGBTQ lifestyle without affirming them, but affirming them is what they would view as good. So, how do we get our own mind wrapped around the fact that we're going to do what the Bible says is good, and yet we're still not going to be viewed in a positive light?
And I think part of it is just articulating that. Just be ready for that. Yeah. A lot of it is, I think it takes us by surprise. We have lived so long with Christian virtues being considered to be good for the world. We've lived that way so long that somehow we're surprised at the change, because you're right. If you are to adopt a child who is in the foster care system and you're doing that good, then you're likely to get pushed back against, well, you're just doing that because, or you are going to indoctrinate that child in your way, or whatever it may be. You're going to get negatives even in this good act that at one time would have been seen as part of our Christian values, our Christian ethic of life. It would have all been seen that way. And now it's just not. There will be something found wrong with that. To be ready for that, and to be ready to respond not in hatred or in harshness, but rather simply through a persistence in good. And that's what we see, I think, in the second century church. That's one of the things that I talked about in the lecture. In the second century church, it was just a persistent plugging away in what was really good for the civic order, recognizing that they may never impact anyone in the sense of them suddenly thinking, oh, Christians are not that bad after all. No, that didn't happen. That didn't change in their era. But they kept persisting in these ways of life that were not merely good, but they were radically good, going far beyond the ethics of the world around them. And that's where I think we can really shine as Christians. Again, I'm not saying this that we're going to gain the world's favor. Right. We're not in it for the world's favor. We're not doing it to gain the love of the world. We're doing it to show the world the love of Christ. And so in doing this, if we go above and beyond, like the people that are adopting children in foster care are overwhelmingly Christians. We are just doing that to an extreme degree. The people who are caring for the poor, the people who are engaging in all these different things that are just good for your city, to do those things, not to gain the world's approval, but and to do this out of the overflow of grace, really, for the world. And that's part of what we need to recognize and to see ourselves doing in response to the things happening around us.
A friend of mine said a couple of years ago, as we were coming through COVID and coming out of it, he's a pastor. He said, I'm realizing that I'm going to need to train up persecution-proof Christians in the church. I'm feeling like we probably haven't done that. I think that's what you're describing. Dr. Jones, can you give us an example of a conversation with someone who does not believe in the Lord, and maybe how some of these things that you're talking about would come to play in that conversation?
Well, a few years ago, I stepped into student ministry for a few months. I did student ministry back in the 90s and early 2000s, and I hadn't done it for a long, long time. So I stepped into a temporary role for just a few months in 2019. And I used that because it gave me almost a Rip Van Winkle moment where I had not been in that context, at least at quite that level, for 20 plus years, and then suddenly I was in that context again, and it helped me to see some of these things in sharp relief. But there was a young woman who would come to youth group from time to time, and she identified as bisexual sometimes. A few times she said she was also transgender. I think she was just struggling with a lot of things even within herself, did not come from a good home background, a lot of things going on in that. But what was most fascinating in that is there came a point at which I had a chance to talk to her about the gospel and talk to her about what it means to believe and trust in Jesus. And what was heartbreaking, interesting, but also enlightening in that moment is that when I presented the evidence and talking about the resurrection, she said, I think, because we talked about this in youth group, I talked about some different things in that. She said, I think it's convincing. I think that historically Jesus really rose from the dead. She didn't have any doubts that Jesus was really alive. Now, back in the 90s, that would have been something that, then this is time for us to pray together and commit your life to Jesus. There was not a wall between there. Once somebody was convinced of that, then that opened the door. And she said, but I really can't believe in Christianity if Christianity can't affirm my sexual identity. As whoa. So she admitted that the evidence historically for the resurrection of Jesus was convincing. She believed the miracle, but she rejected Christianity on the basis of its moral requirements. And that was something that jarred me because of the fact that I just had never encountered that before, of somebody who says, I believe in the miraculous, but I'm willing to walk away from the faith if it can't affirm morally who I believe that I am. And I think that gives us a window into that. I will say one other thing about that, though, and this is something that I think is important for us as we think about that. This young woman, she would come to youth group for several weeks and then drop out angry because of the moral requirements, usually to do with sexuality, that somebody mentioned at some point, and she would get upset. I'm never coming back. All angry about this. I'm never coming back to church. Can't believe you people, etc. 2-3 weeks later, she's back. And then she'd be back again. And this with this pattern. And I didn't ever ask her why that she was doing this, but I think I know is that she was, despite the fact that she didn't embrace the gospel, she was just loved there. Yeah. She was loved. She was cared for. She sensed that people authentically loved her. As difficult as she could be, people just loved her. And I don't know where we lost track of her during the pandemic, and I haven't been able to figure out where she ended up. But I think that gives us a window into something, is that what we need to be able to do is simultaneously to bear witness to the truth without compromise, and yet be a place that is like her. She could come and she was loved unconditionally, and yet continually put before the gospel and the implications of the gospel both. And that's what we have to learn to do. And it's so easy to either lean on the implications of the gospel of you got to be good, you got to do these things and forget the gospel, or to lean just accept the gospel and we'll figure out the rest later and don't worry about all the rest. We've got to be faithful. We got to be faithful to the gospel, to the implications of the gospel, but also to the grace and love that are required of us as people who have been loved when we don't deserve it and shown grace when we don't deserve it by God. All those have got to be together in a world where it's moral apologetics. That becomes all the more important. It's always been important, but it becomes all the more important in our current context.
For every Christian who's listening, interested in living out their faith today and trying to be a Christian witness, I highly recommend your talk, and they can find the link on our Facebook page or on the podcast. Dr. Jones, this platform is called Leadership Lessons. Can you tell us about an experience that you had that either shaped your view of leadership or how you would approach being a leader yourself?
Yeah, and when you asked this question and you said, let me know you're going to be asking this question, I was tempted to let people know some shining moment in my leadership, but I thought it was best to be honest. And if I'm perfectly honest, my first probably 8 years as a pastor, associate pastor, I was a really poor leader. Yeah. I just admit that I was a really, really poor leader. And I had a pattern and I didn't recognize this for a long time, I had a pattern of simply avoiding hard conversations, avoiding hard interpersonal things going on, avoiding hard conversations. And then eventually when it got to where they couldn't be ignored, then I would come down hard. And in my mind, I called that leadership, that I was taking charge and I was going to be the leader in that moment. And I did this over and over. I thought, and partly, honestly, it was because it's what I'd seen in terms of leadership. I thought that was how you led. Yeah. I didn't have other models. Yeah. I was in my doctorate at Southern Seminary. I was doing my doctorate at Southern Seminary. We had an adjunct professor who came in to teach that class, Michael Anthony, who was at that time, I think, a professor at Southwestern Seminary, since moved to California, where he and his wife serve in a church there. But I just related a recent thing that had happened in that particular situation where I'd done that, where it was a Sunday school teacher, he and his wife just weren't showing up. They wouldn't show up. And I didn't have the hard conversation. I didn't go to them. Instead, I wrote them a letter. I didn't even call them. I wrote them a letter articulating how disappointed we were and how we were removing them from being Sunday school. And I described this, and Michael Anthony said, you're going to destroy your church if that's how you lead. If that's how you lead, you're going to rip your church to pieces in time. And I was surprised. I was oblivious to that. And he started working through with me how to be a better leader. And so I began to grow and read in leadership from that point. But it took somebody confronting me and actually saying, you are going to tear a church apart. And in that particular situation, just what I found out later when I finally went and had the right conversations wow, this couple was actually dealing with some really hard issues related to infertility that was making them where they couldn't make it, couldn't bear to come to church. And what I had done is stayed at a distance, then written a letter instead of having the right conversations. And so it really humbled me as a leader. It made me recognize how bad leadership can hurt people. And from that point on, I really became much more a collaborative leader, going to people, building a consensus, spending time with people. Because I don't do that naturally, my assistant, when I hired my most recent assistant, even at seminary, I told him the number one thing is I have to be reminded to be able to go to talk to people about situations and go and speak with them and do that, because I know that's my weakness, and I don't want to withdraw from people. And that's one of the things I've learned to do in that. And it really shaped the book that I wrote on leadership. I wrote one book on leadership because that's all I have to say about leadership. I had one book that I had to say about leadership. It's called The God Who Goes Before You.
Okay.
But it was that as a leader, you are first to be a follower, and that any problem in your leadership begins as a problem in your followership. And that's my basic thesis in the book. Whenever you've got a problem in your leader, it's because you have some problem in your followership. And when I really dug down into it, I realized I had a poor view of how I followed others and ultimately how I followed God. And that was translating into a poor way of leading. But disorders in leadership always start as disorders in your followership and how you follow. You have a disorder in how you lead, it's because there's a disorder in how you follow. And so anyway, argued that in this book, The God Who Goes Before You, in that particular book. It's all I have to say about leadership. But it really started with a professor who was in the front of the class, just said, "You're going to kill your church doing that, and let me tell you a better way." And that's how it started.
Thank you so much for your transparency. That is the best answer, man. I mean, leadership is only learned by leading. That's the only way to learn it. And every leader makes a lot of mistakes, and if we can be reflective and have some counsel from others, then God can shape us and use us even through leadership. Dr. Jones, if folks want to know more about you or your ministry, how can they reach you or find out more?
Well, they can go to timothypauljones.com is the best place to go, just timothypauljones.com. If you're a person who listens to podcasts, which chances are if you're listening to this, you probably listen to podcasts. I also have a podcast called The Apologetics Podcast. Just look that up. The Apologetics Podcast is all there is to it. And on that podcast, I talk about apologetics and rock and roll. And that's because people wonder, why are those two things? It's because it's my podcast, and those are the two things I like, is apologetics and rock and roll. So that's what I talk about on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for your ministry to students at Southern Seminary and at Sojourn Midtown. And thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Good to be with you. Thank you.